There is a version of the final chapter of your life that you have probably already written in your head. Stay healthy. Stay useful. Don't become a burden. Let the younger generation carry the weight now. You've done your part. You've raised the families and served the church and sacrificed more than most people will ever know. The job now is to finish well. That is not a bad instinct. Rest is a gift. You have earned it. But I want to show you something in Scripture that I think most people miss. 4 things, specific, documented, countercultural things, that the wisest people in the entire Bible chose to do with their final years, not instead of rest, alongside it. And every one of them did the opposite of what most people do as they age. Most people turn inward as they get older, more careful, more private, more quiet. These 4 turned outward, with everything they had. Before I show you who they are, I want you to meet someone. Helen, a well-ordered living room on a Tuesday afternoon. She is 76, retired school teacher, grandmother of 7, beloved in her church. She is sitting in a good chair in a quiet house, and she is watching the clock move. She is not depressed. She is not in crisis. She is simply waiting. In the quiet, well-meaning way that millions of faithful seniors wait, for the next thing to come to her. By the end of this video, Helen is going to understand something she has been missing. And so, I think, might you. One more thing before we begin. The 4th thing on this list. I want to warn you about it early, because it was done by the oldest apostle in his final years. When he was so frail, his disciples had to carry him to church. And it is 4 words. 4 words that contain everything he had learned in 90 years of following Jesus. And every person watching this video is capable of saying them today, right now, before this video ends. We will get there. First, let's start 3,000 years ago, in the wilderness, with a man who was 120 years old and knew he was going to die. Thing 1. They deliberately passed their wisdom to the next generation. Moses, Deuteronomy 31-34. Moses was 120 years old. He knew he would never cross the Jordan. The thing he had spent 40 years leading people toward, the land, the promise, the arrival, he would never receive. By any human measure, the final chapter of his story was a loss, a painful, public, irrevocable loss. What did he do with his final weeks? He gathered every person in Israel, men, women, children, and the foreigners living among them, every one of them, and he talked. For the entire book of Deuteronomy, Moses speaks. He retells the whole story of the Exodus, not because they had forgotten it, but because he wanted them to understand it differently than they did when they were living it. He teaches the law again, not as a list of rules, but as a life. He writes a song and teaches it to the entire nation, so that even after he was gone, his voice would still be in their mouths. Then, tribe by tribe, he blesses every family in Israel. He closes every chapter of unfinished relationship he can still reach. The Jewish Theological Seminary describes Moses' farewell not as a retirement speech, but as his greatest act of leadership. He filled the people with hope and promise as he spoke to their best selves, putting into words what they instinctively knew but could not quite articulate. Moses, at 120, physically unable to cross the Jordan, never to receive what he had worked toward his whole life, did the most important teaching of his entire life. Not his most dramatic, not his most miraculous, his most important, because it was the teaching that would outlast him by millennia. Even when I am old and grey, do not forsake me, my God, till I declare your power to the next generation, your mighty acts to all who are to come. Psalm 71:18. That is not a young person's prayer. That is the prayer of someone who understands that age is not the end of usefulness. It is the beginning of a specific kind of usefulness that younger people simply cannot yet offer. Here is what most seniors never do. They carry decades of hard-won wisdom about faith, about marriage, about failure and recovery, about what actually matters and what absolutely does not, and they carry it quietly. They do not consider their own experience worth formally passing on. They assume the younger generation isn't interested, or they wait to be asked. Moses did not wait to be asked. He called the whole nation together and said, "Gather yourselves, and I will speak." The question this puts to you is simple and a little uncomfortable. What have you learned about God, about life, about what you wish you had known at 30, that you have never formally said out loud to anyone younger than you? Not hinted at, not occasionally mentioned, formally taught. Helen. She has been a teacher for 38 years. She knows how to teach. She has simply never considered that the most important class she might ever hold has not yet happened, and that her students are her grandchildren, the young couple at her church who are already struggling, the neighbor's teenager who has no one steady to look to. One thing you can do this week: think of one thing you know, from lived experience, not theory, that you wish someone had told you at 25. Then identify one person in your life who is 25 right now. Find a way to tell them. Not a lecture, a conversation, over coffee. That is enough to begin. Thing 2. They spoke their blessings out loud, instead of leaving them unspoken. Jacob. Genesis 48-49. Jacob was 147 years old and dying. His eyesight was nearly gone. He had to be helped into position just to receive visitors. What did he do? He called every one of his 12 sons to his bedside, one by one, and over each of them, including the difficult ones, the ones who had failed him, the ones with whom his relationships were complicated beyond easy repair, he spoke a personal, specific, prophetic blessing. Genesis 49:28 records, "All these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father said to them when he blessed them, giving each the blessing appropriate to him." The word appropriate is the key. Jacob did not deliver a generic blessing like a greeting card sentiment. He looked at each son and said something specific and true about who they were and who they were destined to become. This was the first declared human prophecy in all of Scripture. Earlier prophecies came directly from God. Here, a dying old man, half blind, barely sitting upright, spoke God's future over his children's lives with his final breath. The tongue has the power of life and death. Proverbs 18:21. That is not a metaphor. The spoken blessing, the direct, specific, personal word of affirmation spoken deliberately over another person, lands differently than love shown through cooking or service or showing up. Both matter, but the spoken blessing is remembered for a lifetime. The grandchild who was specifically blessed by a grandparent carries those words for the rest of their life. Jacob understood this. He did not assume his sons knew what he felt. He said it. There is a counterintuitive detail here that I do not want you to miss. Jacob did not bless only the sons he was proud of. He blessed Reuben, the son who had betrayed him in the worst possible way. He blessed Simeon and Levi, whose violence had shamed him publicly. The blessings were honest, not false. Jacob acknowledged the failures alongside the destiny. This is the difference between flattery and a real blessing. Real blessing tells the truth about who someone is and who they are called to become. You can bless someone honestly. You can name what you have seen, the strength, the resilience, the particular quality of spirit you have watched develop over years of watching them, and you can speak it directly into them. That is not flattery. That is prophecy. And it is something only someone who has known them long enough can offer. Helen has 7 grandchildren. She loves every one of them with the specific, irreplaceable love of someone who has watched them come into the world. She has made them casseroles. She has come to their recitals. She has driven hours to be at their graduations. She has never once sat down with any of them individually and told them, specifically, personally, what she sees when she looks at them, what she believes is in them, what she has watched God put there over the years of watching them grow. She has shown love in every language except the one Jacob chose. The spoken one, the direct one, the one that is remembered. One thing you can do this week: choose one person, a grandchild, a child, a younger friend, and write down 3 specific things you genuinely see in them. Not general praise, specific observations, things you have noticed over years of watching them, Then find a moment to say those 3 things out loud, directly to their face. Not in a card, in person, or on the phone if you must, but spoken. You may not realize what that moment will mean to them for the rest of their life. Thing 3. They chose one young person and invested everything into them. Paul. 2 Timothy. Paul wrote his second letter to Timothy from a Roman prison cell. He was chained to a wall. He knew he was going to be executed. This was not a time when most men would be thinking clearly about other people. This was a time for fear, for grief, for the kind of desperate self-focus that any of us would understand. Paul spent his final letter entirely focused on Timothy. He wrote from chains about Timothy's potential. He wrote from a death sentence about Timothy's future. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. And then, immediately, in the very next breath, he turned to Timothy and said, "Now you fight. Now you run. Now you keep it." And then 2 Timothy chapter 2, one of the most efficient verses in all of Scripture. "And the things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others." 4 generations in one sentence. Paul to Timothy. Timothy to faithful people. Faithful people to others. Paul understood that his death was not the end of what he carried. It was only the end of him carrying it. Someone else had to take it next. And it was his job, his final job, to make sure that happened. He chose one person. He poured himself into that person, deliberately, consistently, over years. And then, from a chain, dying, he wrote that person the most important letter he had left in him. Now, I want to tell you about John. The Apostle John survived everything. He watched Jesus die. He watched every other apostle be martyred. He was exiled to an island. He wrote the most theologically profound gospel in the New Testament, 3 letters, and the entire book of Revelation. He outlived every Roman emperor who tried to kill him. And in his final years in Ephesus, when he was so old and frail that his disciples had to carry him to church in their arms, he gathered young disciples around him anyway. He did not conclude that his age had made him irrelevant. He showed up. He showed up to be with younger believers. He showed up to be known by them. He showed up because he understood that what he carried, what 90 years of following Jesus had put in him, needed to go somewhere before he was gone. We will hear what he said to them in a moment. First, this. Most seniors do not have a Timothy. They have acquaintances, children, grandchildren, neighbors. But they do not have one younger person into whom they are deliberately, consistently, intentionally pouring what they know. The mentoring relationship, where an older person says to a younger one, even without using those words, "I am going to give you what I've learned, and I believe you can carry it," is one of the rarest and most powerful things in human life. It does not require a formal program. It requires choosing one person, someone younger, someone whose potential you can see more clearly than they can see it themselves, and beginning to show up for them with intention. There is a 24-year-old woman in Helen's church, recently married, recently overwhelmed, recently wondering, quietly, in the way young women wonder when they don't yet have the language for it, whether she is capable of the life she has chosen. She has glanced at Helen across the sanctuary more than once. Something in the older woman's quiet steadiness draws her. Helen has never noticed. But she is there. She has always been there. One thing you can do this week, think of one younger person in your life whose potential you can see more clearly than they can. You do not need a title or a program. You need one coffee. One conversation where you say, honestly and simply, "I see something in you, and I'd like to spend some time with you." That sentence changes lives. You already know it does. You may have heard a version of it once yourself. Thing 4. They distilled everything they knew into one simple, repeatable truth. John the Apostle, as recorded by Jerome Now. The 4th thing. John was being carried to church in old men's arms. His voice was so weak it could barely be heard across a room. He had outlived everyone. He had seen everything. He had written more of the New Testament than almost anyone. And every time his disciples brought him to be with the community, every single time, he said the same thing. Little children, love one another. That was it. Every gathering. Same 4 words. His disciples grew frustrated. They had heard it hundreds of times. They were sitting with the greatest living apostle, a man who had reclined against Jesus at the Last Supper, who had stood at the foot of the cross, who had received the revelation on Patmos, and all he would say was 4 words they had heard since childhood. Finally they asked him, "Teacher, why do you always say this?" Jerome records John's answer. And I want you to sit with it, because it is one of the most luminous sentences in all of Christian history, because it is the Lord's commandment, and if it alone is kept, it is sufficient. If it alone is kept, it is sufficient. John had lived long enough to watch everything else fall away. Every argument, every program, every theological dispute, every strategy and structure and system, all of it distilled over 90 years of following Jesus into 4 words. Not because love is simple, because it is the deepest thing. Everything else is the surface. This is the bottom. Strip everything away, and this is what remains. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. 1 John 4:7-8. John did not write that verse in his prime. He wrote it in his old age, after everything. After the martyrdoms and the exile and the decades of watching the church struggle and split and survive. That is not young theology. That is the theology of someone who has lived long enough to know what holds. Here is what most people never do. They carry wisdom accumulated over 7 or 8 decades, and they carry it as a complicated mass of experience and opinion and hard-won lessons, and they never stop to ask, what is the one thing? What is the thing underneath everything else? What is the sentence I would say if I only had 4 words left? John had 4 words left. He had chosen them carefully, and he said them every time he had breath. What are yours? Helen. She has been sitting very still for a while. The clock is still moving. She is no longer watching it. She is thinking. If she had to take 76 years of faith and marriage and motherhood and teaching and grief and joy and gratitude and distill it down to 4 words, what would they be? She doesn't know yet. But for the first time in years, she is asking the right question. And something about the asking has cracked something open in her. One thing you can do this week, write at the top of a blank page. What I know for certain, not what you believe in theory. What you know, from having lived it, survived it, been broken by it and rebuilt. Write until you have it down to 1 sentence or 4 words. You don't have to share it yet. Just find it, because you have it. It has been inside you for years. It is time to know what it is. She thinks about Moses, who could not cross the Jordan, who would never receive the thing he had given his life to reach, gathering a whole nation and teaching them one more time. Not because they asked him to, because he had something they needed, and he knew it, and he called them together and said it. She thinks about Jacob, barely able to see, lying down, being helped into position, calling his sons to him one by one, and looking into the face of each one and saying, "Let me tell you what I see in you." She thinks about Paul in chains, writing a dying man's final words, entirely about someone else's future. She thinks about John being carried into church in old men's arms, and saying 4 words that held everything, and saying them again, and again, and again, until he had no breath left. Helen looks around her well-ordered house. It is quiet. It is beautiful. She has cared for it faithfully, and it suddenly feels slightly smaller than it did an hour ago. She picks up her phone. She calls her granddaughter, the 22-year-old, the one who has been struggling, not to check in, not to ask how things are going, to say something specific, something she has been meaning to say for years and kept assuming the girl already knew. Helen says, I've been watching you your whole life, and I need to tell you what I see. The wisest people in the Bible did not spend their final years waiting to be needed. They gathered people and taught them one more time. They called the ones they loved to their side and spoke blessings that were remembered for generations. They chose one young person and poured themselves into them with everything they had left. And they stripped what they knew down to its most essential truth and said it out loud, clearly, while they still had breath. None of this requires youth. None of it requires perfect health. None of it requires a platform or a program or anyone's permission. All of it requires only the decision, made today, not someday, to stop waiting for the next thing to come to you. You are the next thing.